The black and white photograph sits on Professor Eleanor Ward's desk, its edges worn and yellowed with age. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, sits on a wooden chair, her face solemn as was customary for photographs in that era. In her arms, she cradles a black cat, its eyes seemingly fixed on something beyond the frame. "There's something about this image that doesn't quite add up," Eleanor murmurs, adjusting her glasses. The university's Historical Archives department had been digitizing a collection of photographs from the early 20th century when this particular one caught her attention. The inscription on the back, written in faded ink, simply read, "Margaret Wilson with Midnight, June 1915. Eleanor zooms in on her computer screen, the high-resolution scan revealing details invisible to the naked eye. The little girl's dress, the ribbon in her hair, the ornate wooden chair, all typical of the period. But as she focuses on the reflection in the window behind Margaret, Eleanor's breath catches. "Dr. Harmon, you need to see this," she calls to her colleague. The photograph that seemed so innocent at first glance was about to unravel a mystery that had remained hidden for over a century. The rain patters against the windows of the university archives as Dr. Maxwell Harmon approaches, coffee mug in hand. He's been working with Eleanor for the past 15 years, both of them dedicated to preserving and understanding the historical records of America's small towns. Their latest project, digitizing a collection of photographs donated by the Oakwood Historical Society, had seemed routine until now. "What have you found?" he asks, leaning over her shoulder to peer at the computer screen. The soft glow illuminates his weathered face, glasses perched low on his nose. Eleanor points to the scan. "Look at the window behind the girl. There's a reflection." Dr. Harmon squints, then sets his mug down with a dull thud. "Enhance that section." Eleanor's fingers move deftly across the keyboard. The image zooms in, pixelates slightly, then sharpens as the enhancement software does its work. What had been a vague smudge in the glass now takes on a more definite shape, the outline of a figure standing outside, watching. "That's unsettling," Dr. Harmon says, his voice low. "It gets worse," Eleanor replies, scrolling to another section of the photograph. "Look at the edge of the frame, there on the side table next to the girl. That's a newspaper." Another enhancement brings the partial headline into focus. "Child missing, second this month." Dr. Harmon straightens up, his academic detachment momentarily shaken. "Do we have any information about this photograph? The girl, the location?" Eleanor nods. "The donation records say it was taken in Oakwood, Illinois. The subject is Margaret Wilson, daughter of the town physician. According to the catalog notes, it was taken in June 1915 by a traveling photographer who visited the town twice yearly." "A traveling photographer," Dr. Harmon repeats, his tone thoughtful. "And missing children mentioned in the newspaper. I don't like the conjunction of those elements." Eleanor pulls up the digital archives of the Oakwood Gazette from 1915. After a few minutes of searching, she finds what she's looking for. "June 12, 1915. She reads aloud. "Second child missing. Town in fear. 6-year-old Thomas Baker vanished while playing in his front yard on Thursday afternoon. This marks the second disappearance following 7-year-old Emily Collins, who went missing on her way home from school on May 27th. Sheriff Parker has requested assistance from county authorities." The photograph was taken on June 15th, Dr. Harmon notes, checking the inscription again. 3 days after this article was published. Eleanor nods, her expression grave. "And look at the date stamp on the donation records. These materials were submitted to the Oakwood Historical Society in 1978 by a woman named Sarah Hayes. According to the notes, she was the granddaughter of Margaret Wilson. So Margaret survived whatever was happening in Oakwood," Dr. Harmon muses. "That's something at least." Eleanor is already typing again, searching through census and public records. According to town records, Dr. Thomas Wilson was a respected physician in Oakwood from 1907 until July 1915, when the family abruptly relocated. No forwarding address recorded. "Just weeks after this photograph was taken," Dr. Harmon says, pacing now. "The timing can't be coincidental." "I'm going to search for newspaper archives from surrounding counties," Eleanor says. "If there was a pattern of disappearances." The clock on the wall ticks steadily as they work, the rain outside growing heavier. Lightning occasionally illuminates the tall windows of the archive room, casting long shadows across the stacks of files and photographs waiting to be digitized. In the summer of 1915, the small town of Oakwood was like many others across America. While news of the Great War in Europe dominated headlines, daily life continued with a sense of determined normalcy. On Maple Street stood the Wilson family home, a handsome two-story house with a wraparound porch and carefully tended gardens. 8-year-old Margaret Wilson was known throughout the neighborhood for her curious nature and the black cat that followed her everywhere. Midnight, as she called him, had appeared on their doorstep during a storm the previous winter, and the two had been inseparable ever since. Margaret's father, Dr. Thomas Wilson, was the town's most respected physician. Her mother, Elizabeth, was active in the local suffragette movement, often hosting meetings in their parlor where women discussed the radical notion of winning the right to vote. It was a Tuesday morning when the traveling photographer, Mr. Sullivan, arrived in Oakwood. He came twice yearly, setting up his equipment in the town hall and offering his services to families wanting to preserve their likenesses for posterity. "Margaret, do sit still," Elizabeth Wilson sighed, adjusting the bow in her daughter's dark hair. "Mr. Sullivan is a very busy man, and we mustn't waste his time." Margaret fidgeted on the wooden chair, uncomfortable in her starched white dress and polished shoes. The collar itched against her neck, and the new leather shoes pinched her toes. She longed to be outside in the garden, where the June sunshine warmed the grass and the rose bushes were beginning to bloom. "Can Midnight be in the picture too?" she asked, glancing toward the black cat watching from the corner of the room. Midnight's tail twitched as his yellow eyes followed Mr. Sullivan's movements. Elizabeth frowned, patting her own carefully arranged hair. "A cat in a formal portrait? I hardly think. Let the child have her way," Dr. Wilson interjected with a gentle smile. He stood by the door in his best suit, watch chain gleaming against the dark fabric. His eyes, however, remained serious, constantly scanning the room as if looking for something out of place. It's her portrait, after all. Margaret noticed how her father kept glancing at the window behind her. Twice now he had stepped outside to look around the town hall grounds, returning with a furrow between his brows. "Is everything all right, Father?" she had asked when he came back the second time. "Just being cautious, Margaret," he'd replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Remember what we discussed, about being aware of your surroundings?" Margaret nodded solemnly. Ever since Emily Collins had disappeared on her way home from school, Father had been giving her daily lessons on safety. Never go anywhere alone. Always tell someone where you're going. Be wary of strangers, even friendly ones. And most importantly, trust Midnight's instincts. "That cat of yours has better sense than most people," Father often said. "If Midnight doesn't like someone, there's probably a good reason." And so, when Elizabeth relented and Midnight was scooped up and placed in Margaret's arms, she held him close, drawing comfort from his familiar warmth. The cat, usually squirmy and independent, went surprisingly still in her arms, his body tense and alert. Mr. Sullivan disappeared beneath his black cloth. "Now hold very still," came his muffled instruction. "This will take several seconds of absolute stillness." Margaret sat rigid, barely breathing, her arms tightening around Midnight. Through a gap in the drapes covering the window behind her, she caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing by. Midnight's ears flattened against his head. The camera's shutter clicked, capturing the moment that would, more than a century later, become the center of an extraordinary discovery. What no one noticed that day, as they thanked Mr. Sullivan and went about their business, was the strange expression on Margaret's face. Not the usual stiff formality of period photographs, but something else. A look of apprehension, perhaps even fear, as her eyes darted toward the window behind her. Nor did they notice how Midnight's gaze was fixed on the same spot, the cat's eyes wide and alert in a way that seemed almost protective. The photograph was placed in a silver frame and displayed on the mantelpiece in the Wilson family parlor, where it remained for many years. Eventually it would be packed away with other family mementos, forgotten until its rediscovery in a university archive donation more than a century later. That evening, as darkness fell over Oakwood, Dr. Thomas Wilson sat in his study, a glass of brandy untouched on the desk before him. The day's newspaper lay open, the headline about young Thomas Baker's disappearance seeming to accuse him with its bold type. He'd had his suspicions for weeks now, ever since Emily Collins vanished. The traveling photographer had been in town that week as well, though few made the connection. Sullivan was a familiar face in Oakwood, having visited twice yearly for the past 3 years. His photographs adorned many homes throughout the town. Smiling children, solemn parents, family groups arranged according to the formal customs of the day. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering the moment in town hall when he'd stepped outside and seen the figure lurking near the window. A tall man in a dark coat who'd quickly turned away when noticed. Not Sullivan, who was inside with his camera, but someone else, someone watching. He opened the drawer of his desk and removed a folder containing newspaper clippings he'd been collecting from neighboring towns. Children missing in Millfield last October, just days after Sullivan's visit there. A similar case in Coopersville the year before. No bodies ever found, no ransom demands, just children vanishing without a trace. Thomas had written to colleagues in these towns, making discreet inquiries. The answers had been troubling. In each case, the missing children had sat for photographs shortly before their disappearances. The connection seemed obvious to him now, though he had no proof beyond circumstantial evidence and his own growing certainty. Sullivan wasn't working alone. That much was clear from what he'd seen today. But how to proceed? Who to trust? Sheriff Parker was a good man, but overworked and underfunded. The county authorities had bigger concerns than the disappearances of 2 children, tragic as they were. Without concrete evidence, Thomas knew his suspicions about Sullivan would sound like the paranoid ramblings of an overprotective father. He drained his brandy in a single swallow. Decision made. Tomorrow he would develop the photograph taken today. If he was right about what might be captured in the background, the figure at the window, perhaps that would be enough to convince Parker to detain Sullivan before he moved on to the next town. And if not, Thomas glanced upward, thinking of Margaret sleeping peacefully in her room, midnight curled at her feet. He would do whatever was necessary to protect his daughter and to prevent other children from meeting the fate he feared had befallen Emily Collins and Thomas Baker. As he climbed the stairs to bed, a floorboard creaked beneath his foot. Through the front window, he caught a glimpse of movement across the street, a shadow slipping behind a tree. Watching, waiting, Thomas extinguished the lamp, plunging the house into darkness, and moved silently to Margaret's room. He settled into the rocking chair beside her bed, prepared to keep vigil through the night. Midnight raised his head from the blankets, yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, and Thomas felt an unexpected kinship with the animal, both of them sentinels, guarding against a threat others couldn't or wouldn't see. The timestamp confirms it, Dr. Harmon says, leaning closer to the screen in the present day. This photograph was definitely taken in June 1915, just as the inscription indicates. Eleanor nods, manipulating the digital image to sharpen the reflection in the window behind Margaret Wilson. But look here, in the glass. See this figure? Dr. Harmon adjusts his glasses. It could be a smudge on the negative, or perhaps the photographer himself. I thought so too at first, Eleanor replies, but I've enhanced it further. This is clearly a person standing outside the window, watching the child. And look at the angle of light. This was taken inside the town hall. According to the records, that window faced the town square. She taps a few keys, and the image zooms in further on the window's reflection. The blurry outline becomes slightly clearer. A tall figure in dark clothing, partially obscured but unmistakably present. There's something else, Eleanor continues, moving the focus to the corner of the photograph. This small portion of a newspaper on the table beside her. I've enhanced it enough to read the headline. The fragmented headline reads, "Child missing, second this month." This can't be coincidence, Dr. Harmon says, his voice tight. We need to cross-reference this with newspaper archives from Oakwood in 1915. Eleanor is already typing. I'm accessing the digital newspaper archive now. The Oakwood Gazette, June 12, 1915, fills the screen. Second child missing, town in fear. The article details the disappearance of 6-year-old Thomas Baker, who vanished while playing in his front yard. He was the second child to go missing that month, following 7-year-old Emily Collins, who disappeared on her way home from school. The photograph was taken on June 15th, Eleanor notes, 3 days after this was published. Dr. Harmon begins pacing, his tweed jacket catching the light as he moves between the desk and the tall windows. Outside, the university campus is quiet under the falling rain. We need more information about these disappearances and about the Wilson family. Did Margaret? I'm already searching, Eleanor interrupts, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She's been the department's technology specialist for years, often joking that she'd been born in the wrong century. According to town records, Dr. Thomas Wilson was a prominent physician in Oakwood from 1907 until, she pauses, her expression changing, until July 1915, when the family abruptly moved away. No forwarding address recorded. Just weeks after this photograph was taken, Dr. Harmon muses. What else can we find about Margaret Wilson? Eleanor's fingers fly across the keyboard. Birth records show she was born in 1907, but I can't find any further records for her in Oakwood after the family left. It's as if she disappeared from the historical record. Or her identity was changed, Dr. Harmon suggests, stroking his beard thoughtfully. What about the missing children? Were they ever found? More typing, more searching. Eleanor's face grows pale as she reads the results. No, both cases went cold. The newspapers followed the story for months, but eventually, she doesn't need to finish the sentence. They both know how such stories typically ended in that era, before modern investigative techniques and communication systems. Dr. Harmon leans against the desk. So we have a photograph of a child with a strange figure reflected in the window, taken during a time when children were disappearing, and shortly afterward, her family vanishes from the historical record. There's something else, Eleanor says, her voice quieter now. I've been running facial recognition software on digital archives from that period. Look what I found in the Boston Herald, dated September 1915. She pulls up another image, a grainy newspaper photograph of a man being led away by police. The caption reads, "Suspect apprehended in relation to missing children." Is that, Dr. Harmon begins, leaning closer to the screen, Mr. Sullivan, the traveling photographer. The silence in the room is broken only by the gentle hum of the computer and the persistent tapping of rain against the windows. We need to alert the Historical Society in Oakwood, Eleanor finally says, and possibly law enforcement. If we're looking at evidence connected to historical crimes, let's not jump to conclusions, Dr. Harmon cautions, though his usually composed demeanor is visibly shaken. We're historians, not detectives. We need more information before we start making accusations about people who lived a century ago. Eleanor nods, but her eyes return to the photograph of young Margaret Wilson and her cat. I can't help but wonder what happened to her, she murmurs, and why no one noticed what was captured in this image until now. Dr. Harmon reaches for his coat. I think we should extend our research trip to Boston. If Sullivan was arrested there, the police records might still exist. And I have a colleague at Boston University who specializes in criminology in the early 20th century. Eleanor is already shutting down her computer. I'll book the flights. As they prepare to leave, Dr. Harmon pauses, looking back at the enlarged photograph still displayed on the wall screen. From this angle, the reflection in the window is even more distinct. A man watching, his face partially visible now that the enhancement software has done its work. What were you doing there? He murmurs to the figure. And what became of the children who disappeared? In 1915, the day after Margaret's photograph was taken, Dr. Thomas Wilson rose before dawn. He'd spent a restless night, alternating between keeping watch in Margaret's room and checking the street outside for signs of the lurking figure. Now, as the first light of day filtered through the curtains, he made his way to his private dark room in the basement. Photography had been a hobby of his for years, something Elizabeth gently teased him about. A doctor with the soul of an artist. The dark room was small but well equipped, with everything needed to develop and print his own photographs. Today, however, he wasn't working with one of his own images. The plate from Sullivan's camera sat in his pocket, obtained through means he preferred not to dwell on. A brief visit to the photographer's temporary studio late the previous night, a distraction created by a medical emergency at the hotel where Sullivan was staying, and the opportunity to examine and switch the plate containing Margaret's image. Sullivan would discover the substitution eventually, of course, but by then, Thomas hoped to have evidence to take to Sheriff Parker. Working carefully in the red-tinted light, he developed the negative. As the image slowly appeared in the chemical bath, Thomas held his breath. There, in the window behind Margaret, was the reflection he'd feared. The watching man, his features indistinct but unmistakably present. But there was something else, something he hadn't anticipated. In the corner of the frame, visible on the table beside Margaret, was the newspaper with its headline about the missing children. Thomas had left it there deliberately, hoping to capture Sullivan's attention, to gauge his reaction. A test of sorts. What troubled him now, as he examined the fully developed photograph, was the expression on Sullivan's face, captured inadvertently in another reflection. This one in the glass-fronted cabinet to the left of the frame. The photographer was smiling, a cold, knowing smile that made Thomas's blood run cold. The plate hadn't been positioned correctly. Sullivan should have noticed and adjusted it, but he hadn't. Instead, he had deliberately taken the photograph with that newspaper visible, with that expression on his face. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. They know we suspect them. Thomas realized with growing horror. They're toying with us. He carefully dried the photograph and slipped it into his pocket. Then, decision made, he went upstairs to wake Elizabeth. "We need to leave Oakwood," he told her, his voice low so as not to wake Margaret. "Today, pack only what's necessary." Elizabeth, sleepy and confused, sat up in bed. "Thomas, what are you talking about? Leave? Why?" He showed her the photograph, pointing out the details. There have been 2 children missing in as many weeks. Both had their portraits taken by Sullivan before they disappeared. And look, there's someone watching Margaret through the window. Someone working with Sullivan. "This is madness," Elizabeth whispered, but her face had gone pale. "You think this photographer is taking children? Why? How?" "I don't know yet," Thomas admitted, "but I intend to find out, after we get Margaret somewhere safe." Elizabeth studied his face, then nodded once, decisively. 20 years of marriage had taught her to trust her husband's judgment, especially in matters of danger. "Where will we go?" "My colleague in Chicago has offered me a position at his practice. I've been considering it for some time. Now seems the perfect opportunity to accept." "Chicago," Elizabeth repeated. "So far, far enough, I hope," Thomas said grimly. They woke Margaret and told her they were going on an adventure. The little girl was thrilled at the prospect, though sad to leave her friends. Only when she was assured that midnight would be coming too did she fully embrace the plan. By noon, their essential belongings were packed into the family's Ford Model T. Thomas made a brief stop at his office to collect important medical records and to write a hasty letter of resignation. Then, as casually as possible, they drove out of town, telling the few neighbors who inquired that they were visiting relatives for a few weeks. None of them saw the figure watching from the shadows of the train station, or noticed when he stepped into the telegraph office shortly after their departure. In Boston, September 1915, James Sullivan stood before the judge, his expression one of wounded innocence. The courtroom was packed, reporters from every major newspaper jostling for position, eager to report on the man accused of involvement in the disappearances of children across 3 states. "The prosecution has presented no tangible evidence connecting my client to these tragic events," Sullivan's lawyer argued. "Merely his presence in these towns, as a traveling photographer serving hundreds of families, is not proof of wrongdoing." The district attorney rose, frustration evident in his bearing. "Your Honor, the pattern is clear. In each town where children disappeared, Mr. Sullivan had photographed them shortly before. We have witnesses who saw him speaking with the victims, showing unusual interest in their daily routines." "Hearsay and circumstantial evidence," the defense countered. "Not a single witness has placed my client with any child at the time of disappearance. No remains have been found. No ransom demands made. The prosecution asks you to convict a man based solely on his occupation and travel schedule." The judge, a weary-looking man with spectacles perched on his nose, surveyed the courtroom. "Unless the prosecution can provide concrete evidence linking the defendant to these disappearances, I have no choice but to dismiss the charges." A murmur ran through the gallery. In the back row, a man in a dark coat watched intently, his face partially hidden by a newspaper. When the judge announced his decision to release Sullivan due to insufficient evidence, the man slipped out unnoticed. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Sullivan, shouting questions. He answered with practiced humility, expressing sympathy for the missing children and their families, proclaiming his innocence, lamenting the damage to his professional reputation. None of them noticed when he exchanged a brief glance with a well-dressed gentleman watching from across the street, the same man who had been in the courtroom. A barely perceptible nod passed between them before the gentleman turned and walked away, disappearing into the busy Boston streets. In the weeks that followed their discovery, Eleanor and Dr. Harmon delved deeper into the mystery of Margaret Wilson and the missing children of Oakwood. Their research took them from Boston to Chicago and finally to San Francisco, following the faint trail of the Wilson family across decades. At the Boston Police Archives, they found the original case files on Sullivan. The charges had indeed been dropped due to lack of evidence, though the investigating officer had noted his personal conviction that Sullivan was guilty. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, reading from the dusty file. "Officer's notes, September 1915. Suspect continues to maintain innocence despite pattern of presence in towns where children have disappeared. No physical evidence linking him directly to abductions. Suspicious of possible accomplice but unable to identify. Recommendation to continue surveillance after release. So the Boston police suspected he wasn't working alone, Dr. Harmon mused. Just as we theorized from the reflection in the photograph. They found no further records of official action against Sullivan after his release. It was as if he had vanished from the historical record, much like the Wilson family. Their next breakthrough came in the Chicago City archives. There, among the records of medical practitioners, they found a listing for a Dr. Thomas Wilson, with 2 L's, who had established a practice in the city in August 1915. A minor change to the spelling, Eleanor noted, enough to create some distance from their past, but not so different that he would need entirely new credentials. City directories and school records confirmed that the family, now the Wilsons, lived in Chicago for several years. Margaret, now listed as Margaret Wilson, attended the Lakeview School for Girls from 1915 to 1923. So she survived, Dr. Harmon said with evident relief. Whatever danger Dr. Wilson perceived, they escaped it. For a time at least, Eleanor said, her expression guarded as she pulled up another document. I found this obituary from the Chicago Tribune, dated November 1923. The yellowed newspaper clipping was brief. Dr. Thomas Wilson, respected physician, passed suddenly on November 14, 1923. He is survived by his wife, Elizabeth, and daughter Margaret, 16. Services private. There's no cause of death listed, Dr. Harmon noted. That's not unusual for the period, Eleanor replied. But I did find a police report filed the same day. She produced another document. Dr. Wilson was found in his office, apparently having suffered a heart attack. But the report notes that his office had been ransacked, suggesting a burglary. Coincidence? Dr. Harmon asked, though his tone suggested he didn't believe that. Unlikely, especially considering this. Eleanor slid another document across the desk. 2 days after Dr. Wilson's death, Elizabeth and Margaret boarded a train to San Francisco. They never returned to Chicago. They were running again, Dr. Harmon concluded. Their research took another turn when they discovered information about the FBI's early involvement in tracking suspected child abductors. In files dating from the early 1920s, they found references to a suspected network of predators operating across multiple states. One of their primary suspects was a man using various aliases, including James Sullivan. The files described him as a photographer or artist who gains trust by offering to create portraits of children. Was he ever caught? Dr. Harmon asked. Eleanor shook her head. The case files end abruptly in late 1923, the same year Dr. Wilson died, Dr. Harmon noted grimly. Their research followed the trail of Elizabeth and Margaret Wilson to San Francisco, where city records showed they lived under the name Wilson again, dropping the extra L. They moved frequently, Eleanor said, tracing their addresses across city maps, never staying in one place for more than a year. By 1926, Margaret was 19 years old and working as a secretary at a law firm. Elizabeth had become involved with a women's shelter, helping women and children escape abusive situations. They rebuilt their lives, Dr. Harmon observed, despite whatever they were running from. Yes, but look at this, Eleanor said, producing a newspaper clipping from 1927. Elizabeth Wilson, pioneer in women's advocacy, opened safe house for endangered families. The article included a photograph of Elizabeth standing proudly in front of a Victorian house. The caption noted that the location of the safe house was kept confidential to protect its residents. She was using her experience to help others, Eleanor said with admiration, creating a refuge for families in danger, just as she and Margaret had once needed. As for Margaret, they discovered she married in 1928 to a lawyer named Robert Hayes. They had 2 children and lived in the Berkeley area. City directories and voter registration records tracked the family through the decades. She lived a full life, Dr. Harmon said, looking at the trail of documents. Died in 1989 at the age of 82. But that's not the end of the story, Eleanor said. I've been researching Margaret's descendants. Her granddaughter Sarah Hayes is still alive. She's 73 now and lives in Portland. And according to this, she produced an article from a local arts magazine. She's a photographer who specializes in historical photo restoration. Dr. Harmon raised his eyebrows. Do you think she knows about her grandmother's history? Only one way to find out, Eleanor said, reaching for the phone. Sarah Hayes lived in a Victorian house in Portland's historic district, its blue-gray paint and gingerbread trim meticulously maintained. When Eleanor and Dr. Harmon arrived, she welcomed them with gracious curiosity. "I can't tell you how surprised I was to get your call," she said, leading them into a comfortable living room. The walls were adorned with photographs spanning decades, many of them restored historical images. "I've spent years researching my family history, but there were always gaps, especially around my grandmother's childhood." She had prepared tea, served in delicate china cups that looked like they might have belonged to Margaret herself. As they sat among the artifacts of 3 generations of the Wilson family, Sarah unwrapped the package Eleanor had brought. "This is it?" she asked. Her voice hushed as she removed the bubble wrap to reveal the original photograph of young Margaret Wilson with her cat, Midnight. "Oh my." Sarah stared at it in wonder, lightly touching the glass over the image as if she could reach through time and touch the child who would become her grandmother. "So this is her," she whispered, "as a little girl. I've never seen a photograph of her this young." "Your grandmother never spoke of her childhood?" Eleanor asked gently, cradling her teacup. Sarah shook her head, silver hair catching the afternoon light from the bay windows. "Very little. I knew they had moved around a lot, and that her father had died when she was a teenager. But whenever I asked specific questions about her early years, she would change the subject. It was as if those memories were locked away, too painful to revisit." She studied the photograph more closely, eyes widening slightly as she noticed details she hadn't seen at first glance. "She kept that cat, Midnight, for many years. I remember her telling stories about how it once saved her life, though she never explained exactly how." Dr. Harmon and Eleanor exchanged glances. "Ms. Hayes," Eleanor began carefully, "in our research, we've discovered some troubling connections between your grandmother's childhood in Oakwood and a series of crimes that occurred there." Over the next hour, they shared their findings: the missing children, the suspicious photographer, Dr. Wilson's hasty departure from Oakwood, the family's subsequent flight and name changes. They explained about the reflection in the window and the newspaper headline visible in the photograph. Sarah listened in silence, occasionally nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were finally fitting together. "This explains so much," she said when they finished. "The nightmares she had throughout her life. Her insistence that we children never speak to strangers, never allow our photographs to be taken by anyone we didn't know well." She rose and went to a bookshelf, retrieving an old leather-bound volume. "After grandmother died, I found this among her belongings. It's her journal from 1927 to 1930. I've never shown it to anyone, but I think you should see it." She handed the journal to Eleanor, who opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat and precise, remarkably similar to the inscription on the back of the photograph. "April 15, 1927, Eleanor read. "Mother has opened her safe house for women and children in danger. She never speaks of it, but I know this is her way of fighting back against the darkness that followed us for so many years. The man who took those children, who would have taken me had father not recognized the danger in time, was never brought to justice in the conventional sense." Eleanor looked up in surprise, then continued reading. "Father discovered his identity that summer in Oakwood. The photograph, that innocent portrait that revealed so much in its background, was just the beginning. Father's investigations led him to connect Sullivan to disappearances in multiple towns. But when the authorities failed to act decisively, Father took matters into his own hands. We fled not just from danger, but from what Father had done to protect others from it." The room was silent as the implications sank in. "Are you suggesting," Dr. Harmon finally said, "that Dr. Wilson took some kind of action against Sullivan, outside the law?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Continue reading." Eleanor turned the page. "Father never spoke of what happened after we left Oakwood, but years later, Mother confided in me that Father had tracked Sullivan to his temporary studio in the next town. What he found there confirmed his worst fears. Evidence of the missing children, photographs no one should ever see. Father destroyed everything he found and confronted Sullivan. What happened next, Mother would not say, except that Father believed the threat had ended. But it hadn't," Dr. Harmon said quietly. "No," Sarah confirmed. The journal goes on to describe how years later in Chicago, someone recognized them. "Shortly afterward, my great-grandfather was found dead in his office." "And the FBI case files that ended abruptly in 1923, Eleanor added. "The same year Dr. Wilson died. Grandmother believed that Sullivan, or whatever his real name was, had found them and taken revenge," Sarah said. "That's why they fled to San Francisco and kept moving for years afterward." Dr. Harmon frowned. "But if Sullivan was still active in the 1920s, as the FBI files suggest, Then Dr. Wilson didn't end the threat in 1915, Eleanor concluded. Which means the missing children were never the only victims, Sarah said softly. There were others, in other towns, for years afterward. Eleanor turned back to the journal, scanning through more entries. Suddenly she stopped, her expression changing. Listen to this entry from 1930. I had the dream again last night. I am 8 years old, sitting for my portrait. Midnight growls softly in my arms, his eyes fixed on the window behind me. I don't turn around, but in the photographer's lens, I can see the reflection, a face watching me. Not Sullivan's face, but another man's. Someone I now believe was working with him. Someone I've seen again recently, watching my children play in the park. Tomorrow we move again. Robert thinks I'm being paranoid, but he doesn't know what I know. Doesn't understand that some monsters hunt in pairs. The three of them sat in stunned silence as raindrops began to patter against the windows, the Portland afternoon turning gray and misty. Two predators, Dr. Harmon finally said, working together, which might explain why Sullivan was released after his arrest in Boston, Eleanor added. Insufficient evidence because he wasn't acting alone. Sarah rose and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. She returned with a manila envelope, weathered with age. After reading Grandmother's journal, I did some research of my own. I'm a photographer, after all, with a particular interest in historical images. I've spent years studying photography techniques from different periods. She removed several photographs from the envelope and laid them on the coffee table. These are from various town archives across the country, spanning from 1910 to 1935. All formal portraits, many of children, taken by traveling photographers. Dr. Harmon and Eleanor leaned forward to examine the images. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable. Solemn faces, period clothing, the stiff formality typical of the era. At first glance, they seem unremarkable. Sarah continued, echoing their thoughts. But I noticed something unusual in several of them. She pointed to a blurry area in the background of one photograph, a reflection in a mirror or window, a shadowy figure partially visible. This same compositional flaw appears in multiple photographs, from different towns, supposedly taken by different photographers. It's as if someone was deliberately positioning themselves to be captured in the reflection. Eleanor finished. A signature of sorts. Or a trophy, Dr. Harmon suggested grimly. A way of inserting themselves into the moment, into the record. Sarah nodded. I believe these photographs document a network of predators operating across the country for decades, using photography as both cover and trophy. And your grandmother's photograph, Eleanor said, looking back at the image of young Margaret with Midnight, might be one of the few cases where the intended victim escaped. Thanks to her father's vigilance, Sarah said, and perhaps to Midnight as well. Grandmother always credited that cat with saving her life. Dr. Harmon examined the original photograph again. The cat is clearly alert to the presence at the window. Animals sense things we sometimes miss. But why wouldn't Dr. Wilson have gone to the authorities with his evidence? Eleanor asked. The journal suggests he did, at least initially, Sarah replied. But remember, this was 1915. Small-town law enforcement, limited communication between jurisdictions. And if there really was a network of these predators, possibly including people in positions of authority, he felt he couldn't trust the system, Dr. Harmon concluded. So he took direct action, then fled with his family when he realized the threat wasn't eliminated. Sarah gathered the photographs, returning them to the envelope. I've spent years collecting these, trying to understand the pattern, but I never had the historical context you've provided. Never knew exactly what my grandmother escaped from. Eleanor and Dr. Harmon exchanged glances. Ms. Hayes, Eleanor said carefully, with your permission, we'd like to take this information to specialists in historical crimes. There may be cold cases that could finally be resolved, families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Grandmother would have wanted that. She spent her life looking over her shoulder, never feeling completely safe. Even when she was an old woman, she would sometimes say she felt watched. She looked down at the photograph of her grandmother as a child. She told me once that the past never truly disappears. It just waits, hidden in plain sight, until someone looks closely enough to see it. The rain had intensified, streaming down the windows in rivulets that distorted the world outside. For a moment, Eleanor thought she saw a figure standing across the street, watching the house. But when she blinked, there was nothing there but the empty sidewalk and the swaying branches of an old oak tree. Back in Chicago, November 1923, a light snow was falling as Dr. Thomas Wilson locked his office for the evening. His last patient had left an hour ago, but he had stayed to update his records and prepare for the next day's appointments. 8 years had passed since they fled Oakwood. 8 years of building a new life, of looking over his shoulder, of wondering if the past would ever truly release its grip on them. Margaret was 16 now, a serious student with her mother's intelligence and determination. She had few memories of Oakwood, or at least pretended not to remember. The cat, Midnight, had died 2 years earlier, an old and contented feline who had never lost his watchful nature. Thomas was reaching for his coat when he heard the outer door open. Strange. Mrs. Perkins, his receptionist, always locked it when she left. "Hello?" he called, moving into the reception area. "I'm afraid the office is closed for the..." The words died in his throat. Standing by the door, brushing snow from his hat, was a face he had hoped never to see again. Older, certainly, with streaks of gray in the once dark hair, but unmistakable. "Good evening, Dr. Wilson," said the man, emphasizing the original spelling of the name. "Or do you prefer Wilson now?" 2 L's. Very creative. Thomas's hand moved toward the desk drawer where he kept a revolver. "Sullivan, or whatever your real name is." The man smiled thinly. "James Sullivan will do. We're both men who have used different names when it suited us, aren't we?" "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his mind racing. Elizabeth and Margaret were at home, expecting him for dinner, if he didn't arrive. "Closure, doctor. That's all." Sullivan moved further into the room, closing the door behind him. "You interfered with my work in Oakwood. You destroyed valuable materials. You made certain accusations that, while never proven, caused me considerable inconvenience." "Your work," Thomas repeated, disgust evident in his voice. "Is that what you call it? Those children?" "We're appreciated," Sullivan interrupted, "valued in ways their families could never understand. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you've been making inquiries again, contacting police departments, FBI agents, stirring up old stories better left forgotten." Thomas stiffened. He had indeed been quietly providing information to authorities, especially after reading newspaper accounts of other disappearances with familiar patterns. But he had been careful, using intermediaries, never his real name. "How did you find me?" he asked. Sullivan's smile widened. "We have friends in many places, Doctor. Someone recognized your handwriting on a letter to the Chicago police. It was simply a matter of time." "We," Thomas noted. "So I was right. You're not alone in this." "We are legion," Sullivan said softly, "and we remember those who interfere." Thomas's hand closed around the revolver in the drawer. "Leave my family alone," he said, raising the weapon. "Whatever quarrel you have is with me." Sullivan didn't seem concerned by the gun. "Your daughter is quite the young lady now," he said conversationally. "Takes after her mother, I think. She walks to school along Lakeshore Drive, doesn't she? Such a pleasant route, especially in autumn." Thomas's hand tightened on the revolver. "If you go near her..." "You misunderstand me, Doctor," Sullivan interrupted. "I'm not here to threaten your family. I'm here to conclude our business. You took something from me in Oakwood. I've come to return the favor." He reached into his coat, and Thomas fired without hesitation. The sound was deafening in the small office, the smell of gunpowder acrid and immediate. Sullivan staggered back, surprise registering on his face before he crumpled to the floor. Blood spread across his shirt front, a dark stain expanding rapidly. Thomas moved forward cautiously, the revolver still trained on the fallen man. Sullivan's eyes were open, staring at nothing, a small, strange smile fixed on his lips. From his coat had fallen not a weapon, but a photograph, Margaret's portrait from Oakwood, the one Thomas had taken from Sullivan's studio 8 years earlier. A sound from the doorway made Thomas spin around, raising the gun again. A well-dressed man stood there surveying the scene with cool detachment. "Right on schedule," the stranger said, his voice cultured and precise. Sullivan always was predictable in his grudges. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, though a terrible suspicion was already forming. "A colleague of Mr. Sullivan's," the man replied, and a much more patient one. He held up a camera, a small modern Kodak. "Smile for posterity, Doctor." Before Thomas could react, the flashbulb popped, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, the man was gone, the outer door swinging shut. Thomas stood frozen, the implications washing over him. Sullivan had never been the real threat. He was merely the visible face of something larger, something organized, and now they had a photograph of him, standing over Sullivan's body, proof of murder. With shaking hands, he gathered what he needed from his office: money from the safe, his medical bag, the revolver. Then he wiped down surfaces, removing fingerprints as best he could. Sullivan's body would be discovered eventually, but Thomas needed time to get his family to safety. As he slipped out the back entrance, snow swirling around him, he thought of what lay ahead. Another flight, another new name, another city where they might find temporary refuge. And always, the knowledge that somewhere, someone was watching, waiting, collecting photographs like trophies. Elizabeth would know what to do. She always did. They would send Margaret ahead to San Francisco, where Elizabeth's sister lived. Then they would follow. Once he had tied up loose ends here, it would work. It had to work. What Thomas Wilson couldn't know, as he hurried through the snowy Chicago streets, was that he would never reach home that night. 2 blocks from his office, pain exploded in his chest, a massive heart attack that dropped him to his knees in the empty street. As consciousness faded, his last thought was of Margaret, of the danger that would now fall to her and Elizabeth to evade alone. Hours later, when his body was discovered, the official cause of death would be recorded as natural causes, a heart attack brought on by stress and exertion. No one would connect it to the body found in his office the next morning, or note the strange coincidence that both men died on the same night, just blocks apart. No one except Elizabeth Wilson, who understood immediately when the police came to her door. Without hesitation, she packed 2 suitcases, woke Margaret, and caught the first train west, leaving behind the life they had built in Chicago without a backward glance. And in a comfortable hotel room across town, a well-dressed man carefully added 2 new photographs to his collection, one of Dr. Thomas Wilson standing over Sullivan's body, and another of the doctor collapsed in the snow, his face frozen in a rictus of pain and fear. "The symmetry is rather poetic," he remarked to his companion, a younger man who was busy packing photographic equipment into a leather case. Sullivan finally got his revenge, though not in the way he intended. "What about the woman and the girl?" the younger man asked. "They'll run," the well-dressed man replied, closing the album. "And we'll let them, for now. The chase is half the pleasure, after all, and Margaret Wilson has already proven herself. Interesting. Perhaps her children will be equally so." He placed the album in a hidden compartment of his trunk, alongside dozens of others collected over decades. Each contained photographs of children, families, and occasionally, those who had interfered with their work. A visual record of a dark harvest that continued unabated, invisible to all but its perpetrators and victims. "The world is changing," he mused. "Photography becoming more common, more casual. We'll need to adapt our methods." "What do you suggest?" the younger man asked. "Art schools, perhaps. Children's portraiture. The parents come to us, pay us to immortalize their offspring. The perfect cover." As they prepared to leave Chicago, snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blanket of pristine white that hid all manner of sins beneath its seemingly innocent surface. 3 months after their meeting with Sarah Hayes, Eleanor sits at her desk, composing an email. Around her, the university's historical archives department bustles with unusual activity. Several FBI agents confer with Dr. Harmon in his office, visible through the glass partition. 2 weeks later, Eleanor and Dr. Harmon sit in the comfortable living room of Sarah Hayes' Portland home. The walls are adorned with photographs spanning decades, many of them restored historical images. Sarah, a silver-haired woman with the same dark eyes as her grandmother, carefully unwraps a package. "I can't tell you how surprised I was to get your call," she says. "I've spent years researching my family history, but there were always gaps, especially around my grandmother's childhood." She removes the bubble wrap to reveal the original photograph of young Margaret Wilson with her cat. Midnight. Sarah stares at it in wonder. "So this is her," she whispers. "As a little girl. I've never seen a photograph of her this young." "Your grandmother never spoke of her childhood?" Eleanor asks gently. Sarah shakes her head. "Very little. I knew they had moved around a lot, and that her father had died when she was a teenager. But whenever I asked specific questions about her early years, she would change the subject. She studies the photograph more closely. She kept that cat Midnight for many years. I remember her telling stories about how it once saved her life, though she never explained exactly how." Dr. Harmon and Eleanor exchange glances. "Ms. Hayes," Eleanor begins carefully, "in our research, we've discovered some troubling connections between your grandmother's childhood in Oakwood and a series of crimes that occurred there. Over the next hour, they share their findings. The missing children, the suspicious photographer, Dr. Wilson's journal, and the family's subsequent flight and name changes. Sarah listens in silence, occasionally nodding as if pieces of a puzzle are finally fitting together. "This explains so much," she says when they finish. "The nightmares she had throughout her life, her insistence that we children never speak to strangers, never allow our photographs to be taken by anyone we didn't know well." She rises and goes to a bookshelf, retrieving an old leather-bound volume. "After grandmother died, I found this among her belongings. It's her journal from 1927 to 1930. I've never shown it to anyone, but I think you should see it." She hands the journal to Eleanor, who opens it carefully. The handwriting is neat and precise. April 15th, 1927, Eleanor reads, "Mother has opened her safe house for women and children in danger. She never speaks of it, but I know this is her way of fighting back against the darkness that followed us for so many years. The man who took those children, who would have taken me, had Father not recognized the danger in time, was never brought to justice in the conventional sense." Eleanor looks up in surprise, then continues reading. "Father discovered his identity that summer in Oakwood. The photograph, that innocent portrait that revealed so much in its background, was just the beginning. Father's investigations led him to connect Sullivan to disappearances in multiple towns. But when the authorities failed to act decisively, Father took matters into his own hands. We fled not just from danger, but from what Father had done to protect others from it." The room is silent as the implications sink in. "Are you suggesting," Dr. Harmon finally says, "that Dr. Wilson took some kind of action against Sullivan, outside the law?" Sarah nods slowly. "Continue reading." Eleanor turns the page. "Father never spoke of what happened after we left Oakwood, but years later, Mother confided in me that Father had tracked Sullivan to his temporary studio in the next town. What he found there confirmed his worst fears. Evidence of the missing children, photographs no one should ever see. Father destroyed everything he found and confronted Sullivan. What happened next, Mother would not say, except that Father believed the threat had ended, but it hadn't," Dr. Harmon says quietly. "No," Sarah confirms. The journal goes on to describe how, years later in Chicago, someone recognized them. "Shortly afterward, my great-grandfather was found dead in his office." And the FBI case files that ended abruptly in 1923, Eleanor adds, "The same year Dr. Wilson died. Grandmother believed that Sullivan, or whatever his real name was, had found them and taken revenge," Sarah says. "That's why they fled to San Francisco and kept moving for years afterward." Dr. Harmon frowns. "But if Sullivan was still active in the 1920s, as the FBI files suggest, then Dr. Wilson didn't end the threat in 1915, Eleanor concludes. "Which means the missing children were never the only victims," Sarah says softly. "There were others, in other towns, for years afterward." Eleanor turns back to the journal, scanning through more entries. Suddenly she stops, her expression changing. "Listen to this entry from 1930. I had the dream again last night. I'm 8 years old, sitting for my portrait. Midnight growls softly in my arms, his eyes fixed on the window behind me. I don't turn around, but in the photographer's lens, I can see the reflection, a face watching me. Not Sullivan's face, but another man's. Someone I now believe was working with him. Someone I've seen again, recently, watching my children play in the park. Tomorrow we move again. Robert thinks I'm being paranoid, but he doesn't know what I know. Doesn't understand that some monsters hunt in pairs. The three of them sit in stunned silence. Two predators, Dr. Harmon finally says, working together. Which might explain why Sullivan was released after his arrest in Boston, Eleanor adds. Insufficient evidence because he wasn't acting alone. Sarah rises and walks to a desk in the corner of the room. She returns with a manila envelope. After reading grandmother's journal, I did some research of my own. I'm a photographer, after all, with a particular interest in historical images. I've spent years studying photography techniques from different periods. She removes several photographs from the envelope and lays them on the coffee table. These are from various town archives across the country, spanning from 1910 to 1935. All formal portraits, many of children, taken by traveling photographers. Dr. Harmon and Eleanor lean forward to examine the images. At first glance, they seem unremarkable. Sarah continues, but I noticed something unusual in several of them. She points to a blurry area in the background of one photograph, a reflection in a mirror or window, a shadowy figure partially visible. This same compositional flaw appears in multiple photographs from different towns. supposedly taken by different photographers. It's as if someone was deliberately positioning themselves to be captured in the reflection. Eleanor finishes. A signature of sorts. Or a trophy, Dr. Harmon suggests grimly. A way of inserting themselves into the moment, into the record. Sarah nods. I believe these photographs document a network of predators operating across the country for decades, using photography as both cover and trophy. And your grandmother's photograph, Eleanor says, looking back at the image of young Margaret with Midnight, might be one of the few cases where the intended victim escaped, thanks to her father's vigilance, Sarah says. And perhaps to Midnight as well. Grandmother always credited that cat with saving her life. Dr. Harmon examines the original photograph again. The cat is clearly alert to the presence at the window. Animals sense things we sometimes miss. But why wouldn't Dr. Wilson have gone to the authorities with his evidence? Eleanor asks. The journal suggests he did, at least initially, Sarah replies. But remember, this was 1915. Small-town law enforcement, limited communication between jurisdictions. And if there really was a network of these predators, possibly including people in positions of authority, he felt he couldn't trust the system, Dr. Harmon concludes. So he took direct action, then fled with his family when he realized the threat wasn't eliminated. Sarah gathers the photographs, returning them to the envelope. I've spent years collecting these, trying to understand the pattern, but I never had the historical context you've provided. Never knew exactly what my grandmother escaped from. Eleanor and Dr. Harmon exchange glances. Ms. Hayes, Eleanor says carefully, with your permission, we'd like to take this information to specialists in historical crimes. There may be cold cases that could finally be resolved. Families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. Sarah is quiet for a moment, then nods. Grandmother would have wanted that. She spent her life looking over her shoulder, never feeling completely safe. Even when she was an old woman, she would sometimes say she felt watched. She looks down at the photograph of her grandmother as a child. She told me once that the past never truly disappears. It just waits, hidden in plain sight, until someone looks closely enough to see it. 3 months later, Eleanor sits at her desk, composing an email to Sarah Hayes. Around her, the university's Historical Archives department bustles with unusual activity. Several FBI agents confer with Dr. Harmon in his office, visible through the glass partition. The task force is making significant progress, Eleanor types. Using the pattern you identified in the photographs, combined with our historical research, they've connected cases spanning from 1910 to 1937 across 14 states. The network appears to have been more extensive than we initially believed, involving at least 7 individuals who used photography and other artistic professions as their cover. She pauses, then continues. Most significantly, they've identified remains found in rural Pennsylvania in 1943 as likely belonging to one of the missing children from Oakwood. Dental records are being compared for confirmation. 4 other previously unidentified remains from sites across the country are now being re-examined in light of our research. Eleanor glances up as one of the agents approaches her desk with another folder of documents. The Justice Department has established a dedicated historical crimes unit to continue this work. She types after the agent leaves. They believe there may be dozens more cases connected to this network, and possibly descendants of the perpetrators who have valuable information, even if unwittingly. She attaches several files to the email. I've included their official statement about the investigation, which acknowledges your contribution while respecting your privacy as requested. Also attached is the enhanced digital restoration of your grandmother's photograph that you asked for. Our technicians have further clarified the reflection in the window, though I should warn you, the image is disturbing in its clarity. Eleanor hesitates before her final paragraph. Sarah, on a personal note, I want to thank you for your courage in sharing your grandmother's story. What began as an academic curiosity about an old photograph has become something much more important. Because of your family's records and your own research, long-forgotten victims may finally receive justice and their families closure. Margaret would be proud. She signs the email and sends it, then turns her attention to the framed copy of the photograph now hanging on her office wall. Young Margaret Wilson sits solemnly with Midnight in her arms, both of them alert to the danger just outside the frame. A danger captured inadvertently by the very person who posed the threat, preserved for over a century until modern technology and determined historians revealed what had always been hidden in plain sight. The task force is making significant progress, Eleanor types. Using the pattern you identified in the photographs combined with our historical research, they've connected cases spanning from 1910 to 1937 across 14 states. The network appears to have been more extensive than we initially believed, involving at least 7 individuals who used photography and other artistic professions as their cover. She pauses, then continues. Most significantly, they've identified remains found in rural Pennsylvania in 1943 as likely belonging to one of the missing children from Oakwood. Dental records are being compared for confirmation. 4 other previously unidentified remains from sites across the country are now being re-examined in light of our research. Eleanor glances up as one of the agents approaches her desk with another folder of documents. The Justice Department has established a dedicated historical crimes unit to continue this work. She types after the agent leaves. They believe there may be dozens more cases connected to this network and possibly descendants of the perpetrators who have valuable information, even if unwittingly. She attaches several files to the email. I've included their official statement about the investigation, which acknowledges your contribution while respecting your privacy as requested. Also attached is the enhanced digital restoration of your grandmother's photograph that you asked for. Our technicians have further clarified the reflection in the window, though I should warn you, the image is disturbing in its clarity. Eleanor hesitates before her final paragraph. Sarah, on a personal note, I want to thank you for your courage in sharing your grandmother's story. What began as an academic curiosity about an old photograph has become something much more important. Because of your family's records and your own research, long-forgotten victims may finally receive justice and their family's closure. Margaret would be proud. She signs the email and sends it, then turns her attention to the framed copy of the photograph now hanging on her office wall. Young Margaret Wilson sits solemnly with midnight in her arms, both of them alert to the danger just outside the frame, a danger captured inadvertently by the very person who posed the threat, preserved for over a century until modern technology and determined historians revealed what had always been hidden in plain sight. The black cat's eyes, fixed on the window's reflection, seemed to stare across time with an almost human awareness, a silent witness to both the darkness that lurked in the shadows and the courage of those who faced it. As Eleanor studies the image, she's reminded of something Dr. Harmon said when they first discovered what was hidden in the photograph. History isn't just what we choose to record, it's also what's captured accidentally, waiting for someone to notice. She turns back to her computer as another email arrives, this one from a colleague at a university in Seattle who has discovered another photograph with similar characteristics, this one from 1922. The work continues, one image at a time, piecing together a dark chapter of history that almost remained buried in the shadows. Dr. Harmon knocks on her doorframe, coat in hand. Ready for the meeting with the FBI behavioral analysis team? Eleanor nods, gathering her files. Do you think they'll find him? The man in the reflection? Dr. Harmon considers this. Perhaps not. It's been over a century after all. But his methods, his organization, those might still exist in some form. And that's what we need to understand. As they walk through the campus toward the administration building where the meeting will take place, snow begins to fall, large, gentle flakes that transform the modern university into something timeless and pristine. Eleanor can't help but think of that long-ago winter in Chicago, when Thomas Wilson walked through similar snow, unaware that his time was running out. What do you think happened? She asked Dr. Harmon. To Sullivan, I mean. The FBI files end so abruptly. Dr. Harmon is quiet for a moment. I think Dr. Wilson discovered something in Oakwood that was bigger than just Sullivan, something organized and far-reaching. And when he tried to fight it, they found him eventually. But Margaret survived, Eleanor points out. She and Elizabeth got away. Yes, Dr. Harmon agrees. And in doing so, they preserved the evidence that would one day expose the truth. That photograph, it's both a record of attempted predation and a testament to survival. In Portland, Sarah Hayes adds the restored photograph of her grandmother to her exhibition titled Hidden in Plain Sight, a collection of historical images that reveal more than their subjects ever intended. Beside Margaret's portrait, a small plaque reads, "The past is never fully forgotten. It waits patiently in the shadows, in reflections and background details, until someone cares enough to look closely and bring the truth into the light." Visitors to the exhibition rarely notice how the eyes of the little girl and her cat seem to follow them around the room, watchful and alert, a reminder that sometimes the most important things in a photograph are not at its center, but in the margins, where secrets wait to be discovered. In the final room of the exhibition, a special display has been added, a collaboration with the FBI's Historical Crimes Unit. It shows a timeline of child disappearances from 1910 to 1937, alongside portraits taken in those towns shortly before the children vanished. In each photograph, carefully highlighted, is a reflection or shadow, sometimes clear, sometimes barely perceptible, of a figure watching from the background. These are not just photographs, the accompanying text explains. They are evidence of a predatory network that operated across America for decades, using the emerging technology of photography not just as a cover, but as a means of documenting their activities. What they never anticipated was that these same images would one day be their undoing. And on the wall opposite, a single photograph stands alone, Margaret Wilson at age 82, shortly before her death in 1989. She sits in a garden surrounded by roses, her white hair caught by the breeze. At her feet lies a black cat, not Midnight, of course, but one of his descendants, 6 generations removed. The cat's eyes are fixed on the camera, alert and watchful, even after all those years. The plaque beside this image reads simply, "They survived." Back at the university, Eleanor and Dr. Harmon emerge from their meeting with the FBI. The snow has stopped, leaving the campus transformed into a winter wonderland. They're taking it seriously, Dr. Harmon says, relief evident in his voice. The Historical Crimes Unit will continue the investigation, with our assistance. Eleanor nods, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. And the modern cases they mentioned? The missing children with similar patterns? Under review, Dr. Harmon replies. They're being cautious about drawing direct connections to the historical cases, but they acknowledge the similarities are troubling. As they walk back toward the archives building, Eleanor's phone chimes with a text message. It's from Sarah Hayes. Found another photograph. This one from 1935, San Francisco. The man in the reflection. It's the same one from my grandmother's portrait. He would have been in his 60s by then. Sending image now. Eleanor stops walking, showing the message to Dr. Harmon. How is that possible? The same man, 20 years later? If what we suspect is true, Dr. Harmon says gravely, then this was never about one predator, or even a small group. This was an organization, with members who recruited and trained others over generations. Eleanor's phone chimes again as the image arrives. She opens it and they both stare at the photograph on the small screen. A school portrait, a group of young girls in uniform. And there, reflected in a window behind them, the same distinctive profile they've come to recognize. Older now, but unmistakable. Look at the location, Dr. Harmon says, pointing to the caption. The Lakeview School for Girls, San Francisco branch. That's where Margaret was sent when they first moved to San Francisco. He was still watching her, Eleanor whispers. Even then, or watching for her children, Dr. Harmon suggests. The next generation. Another text from Sarah arrives. Grandmother never let her children or grandchildren have school portraits taken. Now I understand why. As they continue toward the archives, a group of students passes by, laughing and taking selfies with their smartphones. Eleanor watches them, thinking about how photography has evolved, from the formal, staged portraits of 1915 to the casual, constant documentation of modern life. They adapted, she says to Dr. Harmon, Sullivan and his network. As photography changed, they found new ways to use it, and new ways to hide within it. Dr. Harmon agrees, which means the evidence might still be out there, in family albums, school yearbooks, newspaper archives, waiting for someone to notice, Eleanor finishes. In Margaret Wilson's childhood home in Oakwood, now a carefully preserved historical site, visitors often report hearing the soft padding of cat feet on the stairs, or glimpsing a small black shadow darting around corners. The current caretaker, an elderly woman with a fondness for local lore, tells guests it's just midnight, still standing guard after all these years. Some protectors, she says with a knowing smile, never abandon their post even when their job is done. What she doesn't tell them is about the old photograph she found in the attic when the Historical Society first acquired the house, a faded portrait of a solemn little girl with a black cat, or about the face she noticed in the window reflection, watching with predatory intent, or how, when she went to show the photograph to her colleagues the next day, it had vanished from the drawer where she'd placed it. Some secrets, she believes, are still too dangerous to share, some evils still too present to name. But in universities and archives across the country, Eleanor and Dr. Harmon's work continues. One photograph at a time, one reflection, one shadow, One hidden figure brought to light. The network that had operated in darkness for generations is finally being exposed, its methods understood, its victims identified and honored. And somewhere, Margaret Wilson's spirit rests easier, knowing that the warning she preserved in that long-ago portrait, a little girl, a black cat, and a watching shadow, has finally been heeded. Shadow Frames presents Little Girl Holding Her Cat in 1915. 109 years later, historians zoom in on the photo and immediately alert. Remember, history isn't just what we choose to remember. It's also what was accidentally preserved, waiting for someone to notice.